we won't let it run too long. Sure. Yeah. If you need to run just before we finish,
that's
run.
what I just want to tell you. Out of there.
But I hope we're going to wrap it up at 7:15.
We'll just have you walk. I'm going to have you. Can I have you come out in the order that?
Yes.
Bottellier would be third. Roll. 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 Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the first official forum event of the year, and in light of the recent tragedy, we would like to mark that by a moment of silence for the victims of the recent tragedy, which is an international, not just a US tragedy. Thank you, everybody. It's my great honor to be able to moderate this panel tonight, looking at the questions of WTO consequences for China, particularly related to the financial sector. And thank you for so many of you turning out this evening. I think it's true to say that China's entry into the global community, signified by its pending entry into WTO, will be as important to this century as the Communist Party's victory was in the last century for gaining China its independence. Over the last 3 days, we've been discussing here in a symposium a number of questions about what the consequences are related to China's reforms moving forward. We've been discussing financial reform, how this affects other issues such as public finance, and quite importantly in this last day, how those changes affect the people of China through issues such as provision of health care and also questions of social security restructuring. I think one of the findings that we've been discussing that struck me quite strongly was that there seems to be a good deal more optimism about China's capacity to confront the impending challenges that WTO will present than was perhaps the case half a year or a year ago. Then people were giving alarmist tales of financial meltdown, agricultural sectors being disrupted, huge numbers being unemployed. But I think a general consensus began to emerge that did not minimize the challenges that confronted China, but rather stressed that most of them were indeed manageable as long as the Chinese government undertook a number of sensible policy steps in the impending period. So a lot of its discussion was around the question of sequencing of reforms and the kinds of measures that China will have to implement in the short term to avoid longer-term economic distress. So that brought us to questions of sequencing, the managing of the reform process itself, political feasibility of introducing those kinds of measures, and questions around governance and rule of law. A second issue that came up was, I think there was a general sense that while one would agree there's been tremendous success in managing the economic transition to date, the picture has been rather more mixed if one looks at the question of social transition. And there one might make the claim that in fact perhaps China has not been necessarily more successful than other transitional economies in terms of providing the social infrastructure necessary for moving forward. And this was noticed particularly within the context of healthcare, which marked the tremendous progress that China has made, but the particular problems that still persist, particularly in poorer rural areas. And that led us to questions around equity in this transition process. Questions of equity, inequality, of service provision that have arisen. And this led us to think about questions of who has political voice in China, who will speak on behalf of the farmers as we move forward in this transition. Questions of participation and questions of accountability. And I think, though, while WTO, of course, focuses on a number of technical issues, I think there's an underlying presumption that those countries which participate within WTO will share certain common features related to the legal system and the political process. So this evening, to help us think about these issues, or any other issues my colleagues would like to bring up, and I have never known any of them to be shy in that respect, we want each of them in turn to introduce briefly some key issues they wish to raise to you, and then after that we'll open it up for discussion. But I'd like to start first with my colleague, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is here the director of the Center for International Development and the inspiration behind our new degree program on international development. So please, Professor Sachs.
Tony, thanks very much. We do indeed have an important topic tonight because China's entry into the global trading system, a process already underway now for 2 decades, is one of the fundamental changes in the world economy and will be one of the most important dimensions of global economic change for many decades to come. After all, the world's most dynamic economy, which China has been for now 20 years, has about 1/5 of humanity. And as China and the rest of the world more deeply integrate economically, this will have fundamental and potentially very positive implications for the whole world, I believe. I do think on the whole there are reasons to be very optimistic, but it's also important to understand how complex the changes ahead will be. The reasons for optimism are that the formal accession to WTO is part of an ongoing process now that dates back at least to 1980 or thereabouts, with the opening of China under Deng Xiaoping. And we've already seen now 2 decades of results. And the results are globalization at its best, because there are many parts of the world that are globalization with negative consequences or with no consequences, but for China, it's globalization at its best, in that the opening of China has been a huge driver of economic growth, of reduced poverty, of increased technological capacity. And the main questions are whether that can continue and how to adjust to the strains that are clearly present from those processes. Quantitatively, China has been growing at between 8 and 10% a year. It's slowing down a bit right now, but it's maintaining very high growth rates. One of the main forces behind that growth is export growth, which quite remarkably has risen from about $20 billion per year exports, mainly raw materials, back in 1980, to about $250 billion of exports now, mainly or overwhelmingly manufactured goods, and many increasingly sophisticated high technology products. A lot of that, in turn, is being fueled by foreign direct investment into China, which is bringing enormous technology together with the Chinese engineers and scientists and the Chinese labor force. The estimates are, with some margin of error, that the foreign direct investment into China now is running at about $40 to $50 billion every year. That's quite an engine of change. And the social side of this, in terms of improved consumption levels and improved basic indicators of well-being, are rising alongside the general economic gains. But it's not so simple as always, and I'll just spend 2 minutes before I turn it over to my colleagues to say why not. When any economy opens up to the world, the forces of change will affect the economy differentially by sector, by region, and by the even skill levels of workers, who some will be favored, others will not. In China's context, the big gains are being felt in the coastal provinces much more than in the interior. This is opening up many kinds of stresses in China. The coastal areas are tending to boom, the interior is not. Mass migration is taking place within the country. Big economic gaps are opening. Similarly, the opening has favored urban-based industry much more than agriculture, and that will probably be exacerbated by WTO. The urban to rural income gaps have widened extraordinarily, and there's tremendous rural unrest, more than we hear about, of course, in the press, but is absolutely real. Rural interior living standards, that is taking both the areas that are disfavored or relatively unfavored by these changes, in some cases have stagnated or possibly even worsened. So it's not a uniform picture. All of this puts tremendous strain on the society, on the pace of change, and on the demands of, in any market system, of sectoral overhaul, which is going to continue to come in China at a tremendous rate. The state enterprises, in many cases, are shrinking, laying off workers or going bankrupt. New sectors don't necessarily rise easily to accommodate, or at least not in the same geographical areas. So there's a lot of structural stress. And the role of the state, which is vital for any society, is in flux and in stress as well. The government's going to have to cover huge losses of bankrupt state enterprises and of bankrupt banking systems. That's going to open up big fiscal barriers, and yet at the same time the government currently does not have enough revenue to address health issues or education issues. So clearly the fiscal stresses and the financial stresses are going to continue to loom large in the years ahead. Basically, and to close, I think that the balance of evidence suggests that the dynamism of this process can continue, but we have to put large question marks on many social, geographical, and political aspects of the process. And I'm sure that my colleagues up here will be talking about those.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think that points to the issue that while there's been a lot of success, the transition still has many challenges moving forward. I think one of the things that Professor Sachs highlighted is also a political challenge to the current leadership, that if it does indeed claim to represent the nation in its entirety, how is it going to grapple with these issues of different access to facilities, different rights even, that different categories of people have, and different peoples living in different regions can enjoy? And I think that's something that is vexing the leadership quite seriously at the present time. Secondly, I'd like to turn to Peter Bottellier. Peter was the chief of mission at the World Bank in Beijing through much of the 90s. He's observed this process of transition very close up. I should say that we must thank him as he stepped in at late notice to depute for Professor Stiglitz, who, because of obvious events, has not been able to fly up here today. We're very lucky that Peter is now teaching here at the KSG and also at sites down in Washington. Peter.
Thank you, Tony. I don't know what's worse, not being able to fly in or not being able to fly out. I'm in the latter category. I think I don't have to emphasize the historical significance of the China entry into WTO. I think Professor Sachs and Tony also stressed that. I think one question that might rise in your mind is why is China so keen to join if the difficulties of adjusting to this international process are so severe and the social consequences so deep? Why? Are they masochistic? I don't believe at all. I think there is a very, very good rationale, political and economic rationale, behind China's wishes to join. And this is not a new thing. China has been, since the beginning of the reform process in the late 70s, interested in these agencies, in World Bank, IMF. They became an observer in the GATT, the predecessor of WTO, already in 1983. They applied for membership in 1986. This membership-seeking process is very consistent, I think, with everything else that has been going on. It is clearly China becoming a member of the international community and willing to commit itself to its norms and rules. What we are seeing here is a process of institutional convergence between China and the rest of the world. But not only that, within China, the processes of adjusting to external trade and the internal economic reforms, which are also enormously important, have begun to converge. And this has become one integral process. And WTO consolidates that. And that is why this thing is so important. The terms of accession, I don't have time to go into any detail, are very, very strict. I think what the US and the EU and the others in the Working Party have negotiated is really a formidable package. It raises the bar for entry for new members. There are some 30 members or 30 applicants for membership, including Russia. The terms that have been agreed with China will set the bar for the new members. Very, very important. Implications for China are very, very significant across the board. We could go into it during the Q&A session, but I believe China is perhaps better equipped to meet the conditions in the manufacturing trade than in the service sectors. I think China's adjustment in the industrial sector have already progressed quite far in textiles and many other sectors. They've done more than what many people realize. The tariffs and quotas have already come down significantly in the last 15 years. I think where the real breakthroughs are going to occur is in the service sectors and in agriculture. And I don't have time to go into that in detail, but I think China has made very excellent preparations in both sectors, but the magnitude of the adjustments in telecommunications, financial sector, domestic distribution and trade are the most far-reaching in terms of the domestic society, I would think. China will be a great net beneficiary. I think the United States will be a great domestic net beneficiary. Most of the world, of course, is, but some competing countries in Southeast Asia and East Asia may face difficulties that they have not had to face so far, because China is going to further encroach into their export markets. I believe that, to conclude, that there is one aspect to this whole process, Tony, that has not received a lot of attention, and that is the fact that Taiwan is joining on the same day, if it goes forward in November. Now, the fact that neither the PRC nor Taiwan has indicated an intention to apply Article 13 of the WTO Charter means that both sides are, by implication, intending to give each other most favored nation treatment. That is of great significance politically, economically, and could completely change the equation of the relations between the PRC and Taiwan, and maybe even this country over time.
Thank you. I think it is worth stressing, as Peter did, that many were surprised that China did agree to enter under the terms that were offered. And I think there are many reasons. One of the most important of those being, I think, that it couldn't afford not to join for a variety of reasons. Also, as the agenda was moving on, just to discuss agriculture, trades and services. These are all things which were crucial to China's future development. And I think it realized it had to be a part of forming those regulations moving forward rather than being outside. And I think perhaps China's experience has been that it's a late joiner in the international organizations. And so to a large extent, it's always had to respond to rules that other people have made and are now requesting it to accede to on their terms. So I think this was very important for China to enter. One thing, there's a couple of things that we might come back to in the question time, one of which is the time framework concerns me. China has been given an extraordinarily short window to adjust to many of these regulations. 5 years. If we think back to the NAFTA agreement, Jeff would know better than I, but I think Mexico was given considerably a longer period of time to adjust. I think there's a concern there. I think there's also more we need to discuss perhaps about how this will affect the agricultural sector. But thirdly, I'd like to turn to Professor Suijin Zhou. Professor Zhou completed his education here in the US, then went back to the Academy of Social Sciences in Shanghai. And every time I met him there, he'd had yet another promotion. And he is now the vice president of the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. And to all intents and purposes is the executive vice president and has a lot of experience in thinking about how the economic and the social transitions are interacting with one another. Professor Zhou.
Thanks, Tony. I think I just brief some of the thinking on the China's WTO accession, the impact of such accession on China's social security system. I think China is undergoing at the same time two transitions. One is demographic transition. The other is economic transition. I think Chinese population is aging rapidly. Currently, we have about 7% of the population, 65 and older. This figure will be tripled in maybe 30 years to more than 20%. So it means a lot of burden on the public health insurance and then public pension scheme. And on the other hand, China is transiting from a planned economy to a market economy. So the whole system, including the provision, the financing to the healthcare providers, is changing. So we have to balance the many issues, including the equity and the efficiency and the role of the government and the market. I think Professor Jeffrey Sachs emphasized the importance of government intervention in health sector. I think this is very correct. But I think with regard to the healthcare, we can divide the two different components. One is the fundraising for the healthcare. The other is healthcare provision. I think in the second component, the provision of healthcare, the most important thing is to improve, to enhance the provision, efficiency of the sector. I think we can do a lot to reform the state hospitals to make it more efficient. So this will help the equity of the healthcare sector. I think in this regard, we are going to see more intensive competition between the state hospitals and the private hospitals and the foreign invested hospitals in future. I think that this will be good to promote efficiency of the sector. I think with regard to a pension, public pension scheme, I think one challenge is how to manage the pension fund. Currently, the pension fund is segmented at the locality level, thousands of such small pension fund pools. They are inefficient just because of the size. You have a very high management fee due to the smallness of the pool, and it's not very good risk pooling because of the size. So the problem is how to upgrade the small pools at the higher level, to the provincial level or the national level, but given the very high income disparity, even within a province, between, not to mention inter-provincial disparity. So I think maybe one way to do it is to separate the current two pillars. One is the pay-as-you-go social pooling account. The other is the individual saving account. So we separate the two accounts. The first, the government to manage the social pooling account and the pooled at the national level. So it's only about, according to the current dependency ratio, it's about 5% of the total payroll. It's easy to pool at the national level. And for the personal saving account, we should privatize the management to allow the private sectors, pension management firms, to do the portfolio investment in the capital market to get higher rate of return. And then we can use the skills of foreign firms to do it. I think that will be another challenge to the public pension scheme in China in the future.
Thank you. For someone coming from very sedate life in Europe, where not much has changed really since I was born, or at least not perceptibly has changed too much, it's really quite mind-boggling to think about these issues. We're dealing with fiscal restructuring, we're dealing with deindustrialization, while we're dealing with rural industrialization, while we're dealing with shifting burdens from work enterprises into government hands. We're thinking about building up a healthcare system. We're thinking about dismantling certain aspects of pension systems. We're thinking about integrating into world trading organizations. It seems to me any one of those areas would vex and challenge any government in the West and may well actually bring the government down. And yet China is having to deal with all of these transitions at the same time in a very complex, interlocked way, and within a very short window of opportunity. And I think what we're seeing is really a fundamental change has to take place in the way the government operates in China. If I was in China, I think listening to my colleagues and discussions the last few days, I'd suffer from a certain schizophrenia. On the one hand, I'm being told to get out of certain activities as the state, and in other areas I'm told I should be getting back in to these areas. And I think for leaders that have been used to a very statist approach to development, that's a very difficult calculation to make and a difficult process to understand. What should you be involved in and what shouldn't you be involved in? What is the role for public-private partnerships? The last, but certainly by no means least, I'd like to turn to Professor Yashang Huang, who is here at the business school, and together with Professor William Xiao from the School of Public Health and Professor Ed Steinfeld from MIT is one of the co-organizers of the seminar over the last 3 days. Professor Huang.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony. I think the true significance of the WTO is a sort of institutional integration of Chinese economy, not just integration of economic kind. If you look at the economic integration, China today, without WTO, is actually tremendously integrated. The FDI GDP ratio is very high, higher than many countries that traditionally depend very heavily on FDI as a form of financing. If you look at trade to GDP ratio, that again, the ratio is extremely high. So the true significance of the WTO is to bring about a compatibility between a basic ways of conducting businesses and transactions with those prevailing in the international arena. And that's an extremely different challenge as opposed to merely engaging in what some scholars have called shallow integration, which is merely at the level of flow of goods and capital. Obviously, the integration in the rail sector places certain demand on the institutional integration, but you can also imagine a scenario in which the two kinds of integration lack with each other. So critical task for the Chinese reform strategy, to the extent there is a strategy, is to think about ways of making Chinese economy and economic system compatible with the norms and practices prevailing in the international arena. But to project the future, I believe it is worthwhile looking at the past. And I think there is a legitimate question to ask whether the past achievement, which Jeff outlined very, very correctly, which has been by any stretch of the imagination extremely impressive, but we should ask the question whether that achievement is mainly driven by industrialization process or by a reform process. Obviously, the two issues are closely related. It is not fair to artificially separate the two. But I believe in the past, up to now, the industrialization has played a very, very big role in terms of achieving the kind of impressive economic growth that China has achieved. For the future, I believe that the economic reforms are far from being completed. And there are a number of very tough and difficult challenges. And outlining what these challenges are does not in any way imply that the past strategy has failed. What I'm trying to do here is to describe these challenges and to point to the necessity to deal with these challenges head-on before or during the process of the institutional integration to the international economy. Let me just outline some of these challenges. Even after 20 years of continuous high economic growth, the size of truly private firms in China is still very, very small. The size of the private sector is growing very fast, is getting larger, but that's mainly because of the massive entry of private firms. It's not because of the institutional deepening and development of private firms as efficient corporate entities. The largest private firm in China is one in Sichuan province with the name The Hope. I think that's a good name, The Hope Group. It generates a sales revenue of $600 million. In comparison, in India, the largest company there generates a sales revenue of $7 billion. Reminds you that Chinese economy is about twice the size of the Indian economy, and Chinese economic growth has been more impressive. The corporate governance problems are and remain massive for both the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, and for private firms. In my presentation, I only want to emphasize the problems facing the Chinese private firms, in part because the SOE problems are better understood. Most of the truly private firms in China are family-owned, and that's the only structure that they adopt to avoid a lot of principal agent problems, in part because listing to the stock exchange is not available to them. They are tremendously underfinanced. They keep themselves purposely opaque. In an accounting sense, they usually have 3 sets of books, one for the bank to exaggerate their profits, one for the tax department to underestimate their profits, and one more realistically for their own operating management. They do that for a very good reason, because they fear, and these are rational, smart entrepreneurs with extremely high level of intelligence. They do this for a very rational reason, because they fear expropriation and predation by government bureaucrats. There's not a central government policy to expropriate the assets of the private firms, but there is a bureaucratic behavior going after the most profitable private firms. They usually have to adopt extremely complicated legal and corporate structures in order to evade regulatory and policy restrictions and discrimination. Again, those kind of restrictions is so pervasive and so massive, so the private entrepreneurs faced with a terrible choice between not making any money and engaging in fraud and dishonesty. Given the choice, some people choose not to make any money, so we don't hear about them, and then others choose to engage in illegal activities, and we hear them as negative examples of private entrepreneurs. Many of them have to engage in corruption and bribery in order to enter a business that is close to them. The upshot of this kind of environment for truly private firms, I'm excluding what is known as a township village enterprises, which are essentially small SOEs because they really belong to the township government. I'm also excluding what is known as a collective firms, many of which are 100 subsidiaries of the SOE, so in an accounting sense, they're really SOEs. Here I'm talking about firms truly owned by private individuals. The transaction costs for these firms are very, very high. And I believe this is one of the reasons why after 20 years of continuous and high economic growth, you actually don't witness the emergence of a very competitive, truly private corporate sector in China. Much of the export miracle that Jeff described is limited to the foreign invested enterprises, is limited to FDI. And my own belief is that this is so because private firms cannot get financing from domestic banks, from stock market, so they rely on foreigners as a sources of finance. And very often these private entrepreneurs actually have better know-how than some of these overseas entrepreneurs. I've looked at industries such as Chinese silk production, silk handkerchief production, ivory sculptures, jade carving. These are quintessential herbal medicine. This is Chinese medicine. Even there, foreign firms are extremely large. They are actually larger than domestic private firms. Let me just conclude very briefly. One big challenge, which everybody knows about, but I need to emphasize, has to do with the continuing and deepening insolvency of the state sector and the accumulation of large non-performing loans in the banks, which fundamentally threaten social stability and political stability. So there's a political argument in favor of dealing with that problem head-on. And the second issue has to do with whether or not the current government is ideologically committed to capitalism. I believe that matters. Whether they have a capitalistic ideology as opposed to an idea to work on the margin matters tremendously for how you go about doing things. And I think WTO is going to facilitate the adoption of an institutional foundation of capitalism in a way that will further promote economic growth and welfare of the Chinese people.
Thank you. As one of my colleagues said, there's a very famous phrase used to describe Chinese reforms, and that's crossing the river while feeling the stones. But they added the footnote, that strategy might work if you know what the bank is on the other side of the river. And that whereas in Eastern Europe and Russia, it was very clear where they wanted to go, and in part the speed was dictated by political factors, that they wanted to give no basis for socialism or communism to reemerge within the economic structure. I think Yasheng is making an important point that much of the mindset until, and I think that's something we could debate, the last year or two, has been to protect socialism in terms of many of the policies and strategies that have been opened. So the question is whether the private sector then is a forlorn hope rather than a hope. But it will certainly change with the development of domestic capital markets, which will be fueled by WTO entry. Now, the floor is now yours. There's microphones here to the left and to the right. Please, when you ask a question, use the microphone and be brief if you can. The briefer you are, the more of your colleagues will get a chance to ask a question. So please, if you have something to ask, come down to the microphones. The microphones are on the left and on the right. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Let me sort of press on importance of WTO entry and make a claim that really, in retrospect, WTO entry would turn out as a minor event in the process of opening of China to the outside world. We talk about growth in export of Chinese exports. In fact, China already enjoys MFN status in almost all important markets. So I do not see what immediately it would do for Chinese export. Second is that it's rightly been noted that the conditions of entry of China are extremely tough, and people who've looked at it almost shake their heads in disbelief. So what leads you to think that China will actually adhere to the timetable? I think that's a serious question. That is, it may not adhere to timetable. Finally, WTO has not been all that effective. What has it done so far? I mean, it's been in existence. It has solved few banana disputes and attracted number of anti-globalization demonstrators, but it's nothing, as yet, is nothing to show to its credit.
Jeff, would you like to try 1 and 3? And Peter, maybe the second one. So you can deal with bananas.
I was going to stay clear of the banana peels, I hope. I think we've been talking a lot about what WTO does to constrain China's choices, partly out of China's desire to have a clear institutional path. But I do think that it also is important to stress that WTO, if the system doesn't collapse, constrains the choices of the rest of the world as well vis-a-vis China. It may be right that China enjoys MFN, but it does not enjoy the rights of a WTO member right now. And it is subject to all sorts of measures that can be taken purely according to the decisions of individual importing countries right now without international constraint. If the United States wants to stop Chinese trade in particular sectors right now, it has vastly more freedom to do so than it will have under a WTO treaty commitment. And I think that that is the concept of WTO, that it's mutually binding on all of the member governments. When the rest of the world is absorbing this enormously dynamic, very large economy with rapid export growth and lots of dislocation in particularly labor-intensive and standardized technology sectors in our countries, there is tremendous risk that the already leading technology economies, including the US and Europe, would try to clamp down on China and slow down the growth. We have the US Treasury right now trying to pursue policies to tell countries, don't export so much steel to the United States. We have a steel problem, et cetera, et cetera. This could multiply 100-fold. I think that the WTO will turn out to be mutually binding, and that's what I regard as being extremely important in this. Of course, the whole international system is under obvious risk, so what it's really going to look like in the future is a big question mark, but the notion of a legally binding, mutually applied treaty obligation of all major countries is enormously attractive in my view.
Peter?
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I don't think that there's a high likelihood that the volume of Chinese external trade will suddenly grow even faster than it already has. No country in its external trade has shown faster growth than China in the last 20 years. WTO, therefore, is less likely to add to the growth momentum in trade, I think, than to the process of institutional adaptation. And that's the real significance, as Professor Yashang also said. And I believe that with China in the WTO, WTO will become more important. Don't forget that China is likely to be the world's 3rd largest trader in less than 20 years from now. It's already number 7 or 8. If you count the EU as one trader, China is already number 4 after US, Japan, EU. China is the largest trader already. By 2020, it will be the 3rd largest trader, and maybe by the middle of the century, the largest trader. WTO with China is a totally different animal. So I think we should have a broad perspective on the significance of this. There's a lot of indication on your second question, Attar, that China is intent on complying. In terms of complying with conditions for telecommunications, for example, they are already ahead of the commitments they have made. In terms of opening up to foreign banks, I think some of the commitments under WTO were already underway. There's absolutely no indication that China is not intent on following the commitments. That there will be problems, you can take for granted. I think this is a very tough and difficult process. I might just reinforce one point that Professor Sachs made. I think one of the risks I see in the WTO process with China is that either Chinese government will not, in a timely fashion, adapt to the pressures that WTO puts on their agenda, or that some of the foreign trading partners, maybe the EU, maybe the US, will make injudicious use of the tremendously far-reaching safeguards and anti-dumping provisions that have been negotiated as part of the entry package. The rest of the world, in fact, can clamp down on China with little procedure and can claim that within the WTO agreement, as negotiated, they have the right to apply highly protectionist measures, which are actually anti-WTO. That's the irony of the situation.
And I think, particularly in the US, there'll also be tremendous political pressure to go after China if it's seen not to be in accord with WTO agreements. Okay, now don't be shy. Let us know who you are when you ask your question.
I'm Ang Gang Hu, come from Tsinghua University. Recently, I very focused on the corruption in China problem. So I want to follow the SACS method by the World Competition Report. I give some I hope the old professor answer the question is how many scores corruption in China if from the international comparison? The score, if the very clear is the 0, if the very most serious corruption 5, I hope all the professors answer this question. Second question, if the China into the WTO, this corruption score decline or increase? How many scores? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to take that on?
I have a great idea. I'll let the three experts decide, and then I'll run a regression on them.
Yashan, do you want to have a go?
But the number of our observations is too few. Well, China is, there's no question China is a corrupt society. And as we say in Beijing, if you line up all the officials and kill all of them, you kill too many. If you kill one after, every other one, you miss too many. So there's But I think, but the fundamental issue with the corruption is I think the first order importance is an economic one. As I said, the private entrepreneurs in China are faced with a terrible dilemma between bribing and not making money. And this is so we have to think about the role of the government in the economy. And I believe that the WTO is going to reduce the role of the government in resource allocation, and therefore it's going to improve corruption and at least doesn't make it worse. The second issue is the legal one, but I think so far the government has come up with mainly a legal approach, which I believe is necessary, but it is less desirable in terms of dealing with this with the magnitude of the problem. And the supporting SOEs giving at this conference we heard a lot of these creative practices of making loan available to private firms. Then you need to have an SOE as an intermediary between the bank and the private entrepreneurs. Obviously, there's a corruption possibility there. So really the most important approach, I believe, is to deal with those issues. And I believe that China ought to do more on this before WTO. It is threatening social stability in a way that hyperinflation did in the late 1980s. I think today there's really no good political argument against radical reforms today in China. They might have been in the 1980s. Today, the economic argument and political argument really go hand in hand with each other.
Okay, thank you. Let's take a question.
My name is Hương Vu. I'm a PhD student at Kennedy School of Government. The rate of economic growth in China has been amazing in the last 20 years. And a natural question here is how long this amazing economic growth rate will be lasting? And if yes, what should be the engine? In my own view, I see that China facing two major obstacles. The first thing coming from globalization. Right now, as Professor just mentioned, export is a major engine for economic growth. $250 billion already. On per capita, on average, is around $250 per person. And we see Chinese goods is everywhere in the world already. And if you look at Thailand, Thailand had $2,000 per capita, and export per capita is around $1,000, but still only $2,000 per capita. So, if, for example, China can increase their support up to $500, the goods, the world, I guess, cannot absorb more goods from China. So how can China increase their growth, get their GDP per capita to 1,500 or 2,000 like Thailand? That's one obstacle. The second obstacle coming from microeconomic foundation of firm in China. If we look at two dimensions, the operational efficiency or strategic effectiveness, both dimensions for the firm in China quite weak. If you look at the finance ratio of Chinese firms and compare that with American firm or Japanese firm, we see that the the efficiency financial ratio quite low in China, quite poor in China. Effectiveness of the strategy also quite weak. The firm in China, just just follow each other, producing the same thing based on the cheap labor. Mainly, I just say mainly. So how China can go further beyond $1,500 per person 10 years from now to compete in the world and to become a superpower? That's my major concern. So I love the prediction made by professors in many other countries. And my question here is that, first, if
okay, I think
China...
I think we're going to have to, out of courtesy to others, there's a lot of people waiting. It seems your basic question is on how the level of growth can be maintained and per capita income can be got up to similar levels, and that's related to the question of export. So I don't know who would like to take that on as an issue. Peter, would you like to? Thank you.
I'm not at all worried that the world would run out of capacity to import from China. Don't forget that China also has become a very large importer. In fact, Chinese imports have been growing faster in the last year and a half than Chinese exports. If I may just cite one sector to illustrate what I mean, everybody expects China to become an even larger exporter of garments under WTO because they're most suppressed now. But to increase significantly the export of garments, China will have to become an importer, a net importer of textiles.
Yeah.
Nobody realizes that, but the prospects are that China will become one of the largest importers of textiles. Where are those textiles made? In Japan, the United States, Europe. I don't think the issue of absorptive capacity for China's exports is an issue per se. It will take care of itself because China will import what it needs to export.
Jeff, do you want to say anything about the income levels and growth?
Yeah, the one basic point, of course, is that one of the reasons that China is able to grow so fast is that it starts at a very low level, so there's lots of catching up space. And the rule of thumb is that every time you double the income of a country catching up, you reduce the potential by about 1.4 percentage points per year of annual economic growth. So don't expect 8% to continue forever, and if somebody draws lines that show 8% forever, overtaking the Earth, the Moon, and everyone else like we used to do with Japan, one should understand that there's what's called an asymptotic relation, that as you narrow the gap with the technological lead, you also tend to get a slowing down. China's got a lot of catching up potential, but I think one of the most interesting things that we'll see is also the transition from catching up by using imported technology to a much broader production of technology at home, a much more expanded capital goods sector, and a lot more innovation. And I think that's one of the most exciting prospects for the world, is if China gets energized to be a major scientific producer of knowledge, that's a lot of scientific expertise that could solve a lot of problems in the world as well, in addition to generating a lot of revenue for doing so. So I view that as, over a 20 to 30 or 40-year period, one of the most interesting aspects of the change ahead.
Thank you. And I think that also has an interesting reflection onto the security dimension. When people debate whether China would or wouldn't be a threat, a lot of the extrapolations forward of the capacity of the Chinese economy are, as Jeff said, often based on a forced extrapolation of what growth will be over time, and produces very alarmist statistics about the nature of the Chinese economy. Let's take a question over here, and let's please try and keep things brief. We've only got 20 minutes left, so please.
My name is Michael Zhang. I'm a second-year master's student here at the Kennedy School. With its massive population and growing economy, China already exerts significant influence on the local and global environment. What should we worry about, and what can we hope for in terms of China's future impact on the environment, especially related to China's entry into WTO?
Great question. Professor Zhou, would you like to?
I think China has the largest population in the world, but in terms of per capita consumption of energy, is still relatively small. But environmental is a big problem in China, especially in the inland provinces, where the erosion of soil and the degradation of land is very serious. I think with China's accession to WTO, because environment is an international problem, I think, such as air pollution. I think Japan is very concerned with China's air pollution. So we can have more international cooperation on that issue. And the other thing is the awareness of the importance of environment. I think in many poor areas, people they pay more attention to the living rather than the long-term impact on environment. So this situation will be changed. I think that's something I think will have a positive impact on China's environment. Yeah.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name is Jiaying Huang. I'm a MPAID second-year student here in Kennedy School. I'm very concerned about Chinese farmers' situation after China entered into WTO. I just want to ask, if China wants to enter WTO, to what degree can it protect its agriculture? And also, what kind of social safety net we can provide for the farmers? Because the farmer constitutes about 80% of Chinese population, and as Professor Zhou has talked about social security system and the healthcare system, but these systems are basically for urban residents. So I'm just worrying, like, what kind of social safety net we can provide for the farmers. This is very important for keeping the political stability of China. Thank you.
Yeah, this was a question that came up on a number of different aspects in the conference. One of the things that struck me was a specific paper we had looking at the economic impacts, and some recent discussions I had a couple of weeks ago in Beijing, that many people now were tending to feel that the impacts would be less severe than some of the alarmist discussions which had been around maybe 6 months to a year ago. But it's quite clear in certain areas, such as the Northeast, where there's heavy grain production, or the Southwest, as we heard in one of the papers today, Guizhou, Yunnan, which is very reliant on sugar, and those similar products, there might be very significant impacts. But I don't know whether Jeff or Peter, you'd like to address the economic side, and then
I'll say a word about that.
Yeah.
Well, I think it is a very, very important question, and the issue is so large that it is very hard to be very concrete and very precise. I think what is important to realize is that China, by committing itself to WTO principles, is going to follow agricultural policies that are fundamentally different that have been followed, for example, by Japan for the last 4 or 5 decades. China will go to comparative advantage as a basis for agriculture. Now, that means it will probably, over time, begin to import more basic grains, produce perhaps less cotton, less sugar. This implies major adjustments for the farming community, and China has protected itself against abrupt adjustments in the negotiating process by negotiating for the most sensitive items, the basic grains, a series of tariff quota combinations that will allow China to stop imports or to charge much higher levels of imports when the imports exceed a certain pre-agreed level. So that's technically the defense mechanism that China has negotiated in the Working Party. I personally believe that the prospect of larger trade in agriculture for China is a good thing for China. China has to relatively step back from the basic grains and import more from North America and Australia, which will be good for this country. It will have comparative advantage in vegetables, flowers, fish pond products, animal husbandry products, all of which can be produced on less land, with more labor, and from an environmental point of view, with less water per dollar of value added than the basic grains on which they're wasting all their scarce irrigation water today. So I think it's a good thing, but the adjustment process has to be managed very carefully.
One thing I wanted to add was that at the beginning of the reforms in the late 70s, the first major reform was ending the commune system and moving to household responsibility, so-called, with individual plots. And there was a big jump of productivity of farmers, and farmers' incomes rose relative to urban incomes. Since about 1985, it's been the urban sector which has been the engine of growth, and particularly the coastal urban sector. So we're seeing a widening gap between urban and rural incomes, which is very, very sharp. It's exacerbated in China by the household registration system, which, even though it's still coming apart at the seams, still restricts internal migration between rural and urban areas. The government has announced its intention to disband that system over the next 5 years. If that happened, there would be huge effects on migration patterns over time and population patterns over the next 20 or 30 years. But one of the things it would do would be to allow poor households in rural areas to move to urban areas and find urban-based jobs and probably narrow the gap. And that's going to be one of the most important dynamics and points of stress and points of interest also, which is how the rural to urban migration is going to take place, especially in a politically and regulatory liberalized framework. But that's an important safety valve that's been announced.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Siddharth. I wanted to know, like China, India has also had a huge growth rate in the past 10 years. I wanted to know, still though India is behind China economically by almost a 2-to-1 ratio, I wanted to know when you think India will catch up, and if so, what effect will that have on China?
Jeff, I think that's more in your line.
Alas, the one area where India is really vying to catch up is population, where the estimate is that the overtaking takes place at about 2050 at 1.5 billion in both countries, and that India, on current fertility trajectories, would surpass that. Of course, these are mere extrapolations, and one hopes that total fertility rates fall a lot faster as they're starting to do, because the burden on society and on the physical environment in both countries is already very profound. India, alas, has not had spectacular growth. It's had good growth. China's been growing at 10% or so. India's been growing at about 5 to 6%, with China slowing down to now about 7% on the official data. India is roughly 5.5% to 6%. That gap is actually narrowing a bit. But what is striking is that China is exporting $250 billion a year. India is managing about $40 billion. China is pulling in about $50 billion of foreign direct investment. India is pulling in about $3 billion of foreign direct investment. There are many complicated reasons for this, but India has not really made some of the breakthroughs that are needed. And yet, of course, over the longer term, it has a political structure which lets out steam all the time. This is, and lots of it, I should add. And that also is one of India's competitive advantages over the long haul, which is a tremendous amount of flexibility and political dynamism. It's too long a story to compare the two in detail, except to say that India as well has a lot of catching up potential that it hasn't fully exploited yet.
My name is Jiang Tian. I'm a student in GSAS here, PhD student. I have a question about how will the administration in China push through all those tough reform policies? Because as well known, the Chinese government have a problem with the central government and the provincial government. For example, the corruption, as far as I know, major happen in the regional, in the provincial level, especially the town or the city level, and it doesn't seem that many times also the provincial protectionism is hindering the implement of the central government's policy. So how do you think Chinese central government or provincial government or the structure of the whole the government system to have to do to cope with this kind of problem? Because obviously they have lots of tough things to push through, and whether and how they can push this through. So that's my question.
Maybe Yasheng, you've looked at this in the context of investment, inflation controls, and so.
Well, I didn't look at this precisely.
Similar phenomenon.
So if I say foolish things, then I'm forgiven. I want to approach this question from a slightly different point of view. I would have wanted to see more in the WTO deal, those provisions having to do with the restrictions on domestic firms dealt with more, a little bit more. I think in one area, I think it's in the banking, the WTO requires China to open the banking industry to all firms, not just to foreign firms. And I have to really emphasize, this is very interesting. When I went to China and do research on private entrepreneurs, I talked to a government official, and he looked at me, he said, "Are you a Harvard professor?" I said, "Yeah, I am." "Why do you want to study these private entrepreneurs? Don't they just sell vegetables and melons and clothes and things like that?" And I said, "Well, I mean, but that's because you make them do those things, right? And they cannot enter into other industries." But the point there is that the domestic private firms have always done worse as compared with foreign firms. Foreign firms complain about market entry, ownership requirements, ownership restrictions, and export requirements, and they complain that they are not being treated fairly, and the domestic firms are advantaged. I agree with that statement with a twist, which is that the SOEs are definitely more privileged than foreign firms. But the most efficient firms in China are actually much more disadvantaged by the regime, by the current regulatory regime. In the telecom sector, in the machinery industry, in the auto industry, you don't find the presence of many domestic private firms. But you find, if you look at the different product segments, you'll find presence of SOEs in every product segment, presence of foreign firms in every product segment, but you don't find private firms. For me, I think hopefully one of the benefits of the WTO is to increase the demand from the Chinese entrepreneurs for similar treatment. And I think the demand is there. So to get to your question more directly, I think there's an issue of implementation, which is a top-down way of looking at things, but there's also an issue of demand. The demand is there, I think. I think that there's actually a gap between how far the reforms in the real sector have gone and how lagged the institutional reforms are. Guangdong province, for example, would demand a reduction of interprovincial protectionism because they export about 30% of their output to the rest of China, 30% to overseas, and 30% consumed domestically. That kind of forces is becoming very, very strong. So hopefully with the political will and political resolve and a vision, I think this is a big if actually, with a vision, then the demand and supply of these institutions can match.
Thanks. Please.
Ming Shu from Business School. Although the phrase was not used, but my understanding from the speakers is that the entry to WTO is essentially an institutional shock therapy for China. And looking back for the last 20 years, it seems like for the short term and often for the mid to long term, going from Poland to Russia to Argentina recently, shock therapy do not end up with very positive, let's not even talk about pain, but there's no positive results, net benefit to the country that receive the therapy. And from the data that Professor Huang gave, it seems like the competitiveness of the domestic firms is simply not there. So, just from a scale argument, we can see that the multinationals will simply Walmartize the economic landscape, which presumably will have a negative social impact, will have further strain the social fiber within society. So now the question is, within the treaty, are there any provisions which basically allows China to institutionally learn to walk before she has to run? And secondly, if there's not sufficient, these kind of provisions, whether there are any international consensus on how to deal with it in case China as a nation gets out of whack, because under that circumstance, it cannot be rescued by a few $1 billion from IMF. So, anyone can address that.
Let me make one major point, which is to take great care in making a comparison between China and Argentina, or China and Russia, or any countries, because while the words can be used, the conditions and the situation and what they're applying to are fundamentally different. Argentina is a country that produces wheat and beef, and it has a fixed exchange rate that's hugely overvalued, a lot of government debt, and some other distinctive features. Very different from these other cases. So I think that the substance is okay of the question, but I think that one of the things we need to do really carefully, analytically, is understand differences in cases and the structural issues. One point that I would make personally about China is that this is a process that has been going on already for more than 2 decades, and what will be set in motion is a continuation of a long-term change. There's no doubt that China faces a degree of societal change from where it was in 1978 to where it aspires to be as a world-leading economy and member of the world community that is as fundamental as any that you would see in modern history. But it should not be understood that they'll be signing in Doha or someplace else, that China will come in and all of a sudden something's going to happen. That, I believe, is not actually the right way to understand this, no matter what the specific terms are. There will be processes set in motion, but we're talking about a long-term phenomenon here.
Mr. Zhou, how do you think about this from domestic perspective?
Okay, I think I agree with Peter. He mentioned that sometimes China's WTO entry to WTO, the negative impact is exaggerated. With regard to agriculture, in fact, China is a net exporter of agricultural product currently. And with regard to manufacturing, I think we have that the manufacturing industry in China is quite competitive. The actual tariff rate in China is just nominal is maybe 17, but actual rate is only 5%. So I think maybe the real challenge to China is the service sector, especially those protected financial sector, telecommunication, etc. I think this is, in the long run, it's good for China because with the competition pressure from foreign firms, the efficiency in these sectors is going to improve. Without the external pressure, I think maybe there will be some improvement, but it's going to be slower, much slower.
Do you want to come?
You mentioned, did you use the word Walmartize China, Walmart? I think Walmart would be the best thing that will happen to China if I go there all the time to buy Chinese goods. So if they sell Chinese goods here, there's no reason why they wouldn't sell Chinese goods in China. And I say this very, very seriously because earlier I mentioned that there's a lag between real sector reforms and institutional reforms. There's actually, within the real sector, there's a lag between manufacturing sector and service sector. Service sector here doesn't include restaurant business and stuff like that. They are always the territory of the private entrepreneurs. If you look at banks, if you look at telecom service, if you look at wholesale and retail service industries, they are, even after 20 years of reforms, they are heavily dominated by the SOEs. The SOEs don't provide those services very efficiently. And therefore, they actually hurt efficient domestic firms. So to the extent that WTO introduces these efficient service firms, they may actually benefit the Chinese firms in the manufacturing industries. I actually believe that the Chinese government ought to have opened the service industries in the 1980s and then open the manufacturing industries because China has had a lot of potential capabilities in manufacturing, but not capabilities in the service, especially sophisticated service like financial service industries.
I'm afraid time has marched inexorably along. I'll have to apologize to those who are still waiting to ask questions. A number of our panelists have to get off to other events, but I'd just like to thank you all once again for coming, and please join me in thanking our panelists. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you.